April 27, 1945, southern Germany. The sky was steel gray, broken only by the thunder of engines and the brief flashes of tracer fire. Captain Lou Renner's P-47 Thunderbolt was dying. Not from a bullet, not from flak, from heat, pressure, and time. His oil pressure was collapsing. His manifold temperature was climbing past the red line. Every second in the air felt like a gamble, and Lou had nothing left to bet with. They had flown 6 hours already, deep escort past Munich, supporting a bomber run intended to crush the last of the Nazi arms depots. His squadron had taken losses. 2 birds turned back early, another vanished behind a hill of flak. Lou had stayed. He always did. But now, at 17,000 feet, trailing smoke, with engine RPMs fluttering and fuel pressure unreliable, Lou was certain this would be his last ride. Then the worst-case scenario hit. Silver streaks in the clouds ahead. Me-262's jets. The Germans had learned their lesson. They didn't dogfight anymore, not with propeller planes. They'd shoot past, guns blazing, and vanish before anyone could respond. All the Allies could do was survive the pass. But not Lou. Not today. His bird was wounded, heavy, and choking on its own heat. "Thunder 3, break right," came the call. 2 Me-262s were diving. Lou tried. He banked hard, felt the controls shudder, but instead of a stall, the engine caught. A surge of thrust, not a miracle, something else. His bird wasn't dead. It was fighting back. Guttural roar through the cowling. Heat vented, thrust stabilized. Lou climbed, pushed throttle, felt a pulse of power he hadn't felt since the plane was brand new. It wasn't factory fresh. It was something else, modified. He didn't know it yet, but 48 hours earlier, while he was grounded on rest rotation, his Thunderbolt had been torn open in a field hangar by a man named Daniel Rusty Martin, a mechanic known more for salvage than protocol. The original cooling system had failed under repeated strain. Supply lines couldn't deliver a replacement fast enough. So Martin hadn't waited. He pulled tubing from a scrapped Messerschmitt, shaped airflow ducts from drop tank skins, bent and bolted together an auxiliary heat bleed system from battlefield junk and a busted exhaust shroud. No one approved it. No one believed it would work. But in the climb now, Lou's nose rising, engine temperature dropping, jets streaking past as he rolled into a perfect flank shot. That system, that scrap metal Frankenstein, was buying him seconds. Seconds to act, seconds to kill. He squeezed the trigger. 50 cal rounds laced through the sky. One jet banked away, missed. The other wobbled, sparks erupting from its tail. Hit. The Me-262 burst into flame and spiraled downward. Lou circled once, then again, not entirely believing it. His Thunderbolt, battered, scarred, and patched together with what should have been battlefield debris, had just killed a jet. When he landed 2 hours later, engines still humming, ground crew ran out cheering. Lou climbed down, removed his helmet, and stared at the exhaust piping. It gleamed under the sun like scrap chrome. "What the hell did you do to my plane?" he asked, grinning. Rusty Martin shrugged. "Didn't fix it, reinvented it." And that's where this story begins. Not with blueprints or factories, or generals, but with one mechanic, 48 hours, and a pile of junk no one else wanted. This isn't just a story about a fighter. It's about the wrench-turners behind the lines who rewrote what was possible. Not with resources, but with resolve. By 1945, the U.S. Army Air Forces had developed one of the most advanced aircraft maintenance doctrines in the world. Every P-47 Thunderbolt or P-51 Mustang was backed by a chain of logistics stretching from European airfields to depots in England, to factories in Illinois and California. The rule was clear. Damage meant downtime, and downtime meant waiting. For paperwork, for crates, for parts stamped with an official serial number and blessed by Washington. Repairs were fine, as long as they were according to the manual. But if something broke that wasn't in the manual, You grounded the plane and filled out a form. That system worked, in theory, but not in the collapsing chaos of 1945 when missions were getting longer, German resistance more desperate, and parts scarcer by the week. It was in this environment that Tech Sergeant Daniel Rusty Martin earned his nickname and his reputation. Martin wasn't your typical mechanic. He didn't come from an aircraft background. He was originally trained in tank engines, specifically diesel units for Sherman support vehicles. But he had a knack for heat exchange systems, ductwork, and exhaust rerouting, skills that didn't come from school, but from years working on trucks in Oklahoma oil fields before the war. When he was reassigned to a fighter squadron in early '45, most other mechanics laughed. "This ain't a tractor," one said. "You don't duct tape a Mustang." But Rusty Martin didn't use duct tape. He used physics. And what he saw horrified him. Every week, another plane was grounded for a cracked manifold, an overheating climb, or a failing turbo intake. Command would mark the aircraft as non-operational and wait for the supply chain to catch up. Sometimes that took 3 days. Other times, 2 weeks. In a few cases, the bird never flew again. Martin began asking questions, ones no one wanted to hear. Why do we keep losing the same component in the same way? Why are we treating minor performance hits like catastrophic failures? What if we could build a workaround in 48 hours instead of waiting 14 days? The answers were always the same: regulations, standardization, risk. "You mess with an engine spec," a captain warned him once. "And you're not just breaking protocol. You're gambling with a pilot's life." Martin understood. He respected pilots more than anyone. He'd seen what happened when an engine failed at altitude. He'd watched smoke trails turn into funerals. But he also knew this: the system was already gambling, just slower. Every grounded plane was one less escort. Every missed mission put bombers at risk. Every delay gave the enemy one more chance to regroup. And the worst part? The planes weren't destroyed. They were just limping. A 30% drop in climb rate, a faulty intake, a cracked turbo shroud. Not fatal, fixable, but only if someone dared to fix them outside the manual. Martin started small, reinforcing ducting with repurposed drop tank skins. When that worked, he built a composite cowling plate using parts from a shot-down WWII. Then came a full exhaust reflow mod that vented excess heat through an auxiliary shroud built from a water barrel. Each time, he tested carefully. He logged results. He consulted pilot feedback. He improved. And each time, the same response came from command: not approved, not standard, not repeatable. So Martin stopped asking. He started working under cover of night, roping in trusted mechanics who knew the difference between risk and recklessness. They built a system that could be bolted onto a wounded Thunderbolt in less than 48 hours, using only what was already in the field. It wasn't pretty, but it worked. And it would take exactly one mission, one pilot who should have died but didn't, to prove that the greatest lie in combat aviation wasn't that factory parts were better. It was that factory parts were the only option. It began with a number, scrawled in grease pencil on the fuselage of a grounded P-47 Thunderbolt sitting half disassembled at the edge of airfield B-83 near Reims, France. Climb rate down 35%, flagged for depot. That plane, serial number 47752, nicknamed Lucky 13, had taken minor flak damage on April 24th. Not enough to force a crash landing, but enough to damage its intake manifold and warp its turbo ducting. The pilot, Lieutenant Charles Chuck Halley, had nursed it back to base and described it as flying a brick with wings. Engineers confirmed it. The aircraft couldn't maintain performance past 12,000 feet without overheating or losing thrust. The standard procedure was simple: tag it, tow it, and wait. Except depot backlog at that point was 10 to 14 days. The squadron was already short 2 planes. And bomber losses in the past week had spiked by 16%, largely due to a shortage of high-altitude escorts during the final push into Germany. That's when Tech Sgt. Daniel Martin stepped in. He didn't ask permission. He just grabbed a clipboard, walked out to the airframe, and started taking measurements. Martin saw something others didn't: The turbo duct wasn't shattered, just bent. The exhaust manifold hadn't cracked. It had buckled under uneven heat pressure. The real problem was airflow imbalance and a failing secondary intake vent that couldn't regulate internal pressure at altitude. If the plane could reroute thermal overflow and compensate with a boosted exhaust vector, it could climb again. The depot wouldn't fix that, but Martin would. His plan wasn't based on schematics. It was built from battlefield experience, from nights spent hammering busted tank radiators back into shape, from hours logged modifying intake fans on oil-field trucks that ran too hot under desert sun. He knew where to look: the base scrap pile. There he found the carcass of a downed Messerschmitt Bf-110, its twin-engine frame torn apart, but its ductwork still intact. He salvaged an exhaust shroud. Then behind the fuel dump he found the broken casing of a drop tank. Its aluminum was still good, thin, pliable, easy to cut and shape. Add in some tubing from a discarded radio system, a few clamps, and copper wire, and he had the skeleton of a new system. He called it the boost loop. The idea: redirect exhaust heat through a vented shroud, then use residual airflow to stabilize engine pressure at altitude. It wouldn't fix the damage, but it might bypass it. He pulled 3 mechanics into the plan. Over 2 nights, they dismantled the damaged components, mounted the improvised shroud using hand-drilled rivets, and restructured the airflow channel using the drop tank skins as a guide funnel. The radio tubing acted as a buffer coil, absorbing vibrations and feeding pressure forward into the intake. It was rough, unapproved, unrepeatable according to every manual. But it was functional. On April 26th, Lucky 13 taxied to the runway. Pilot Chuck Halley, skeptical but willing, agreed to a test climb. His orders were simple: take it to 18,000 feet and back. No combat, no stunts, just data. He came back an hour later, grinning. "She breathes again," he said. "Not pretty, but she flies." The post-flight log showed something remarkable. Climb rate restored to 97% of original spec. Engine temps held stable. Manifold pressure returned to combat-capable levels. That wasn't just a patch job. It was a resurrection. Word spread quickly. Ground crews started asking for Martin's help. Pilots began requesting the boost loop mod. Some mocked it at first, called it the junk rig or gutter gun. But after Lucky 13's performance, the laughter stopped. Martin had proven a brutal truth. Waiting for the perfect fix was sometimes worse than flying with a patched one. And in a war where hours mattered more than orders, his scrap metal logic was about to turn the tide. At 15,000 feet, time isn't measured in minutes. It's measured in velocity curves, climb angles, and fuel burn rates. A single drop in performance, even a few percentage points, can mean the difference between intercepting an enemy jet or getting shredded from above. In early 1945, the data didn't lie, and the numbers were unforgiving. The standard climb rate for a combat-ready P-47 Thunderbolt sat around 3,200 feet per minute at optimal throttle and low payload. That's what allowed the aircraft to intercept Luftwaffe bombers and, more urgently, attempt to chase Germany's rapidly increasing number of jet-powered fighters. But when damage struck, particularly to the turbo ducting, exhaust manifolds, or pressure regulators, that number could drop by 25% to 40%. In the case of Lucky 13, the aircraft's climb rate fell to 2,030 feet per minute. That seemingly small decrease created a lethal gap. Here's the hard truth. The Me-262, Germany's flagship jet, could attack in lightning-fast boom and zoom patterns. Its top speed exceeded 540 mph, and it could climb at over 4,000 feet per minute in combat conditions. A compromised Thunderbolt couldn't catch it, couldn't defend bombers, couldn't even escape if caught on the wrong flight path. It became a liability, not just to the pilot, but to every man it was supposed to protect. Worse still, Air Command reports showed that over 60% of squadron mechanical failures between March and May 1945 were linked to turbo or cooling systems. The depot backlog in some sectors had ballooned to 14-plus days for parts like turbo shrouds, intercooler plates, and auxiliary duct segments. In effect, every time a squadron lost just one fighter to downtime, bomber losses spiked by 6 to 10% on average for the next mission. It wasn't a theory. It was war math. Enter Martin's mod. After the boost loop install on Lucky 13, engine test report showed climb rate restored to 97% of spec. Engine temp was 11 degrees lower during peak climb. Manifold pressure remained within safety margins, even at full throttle and high fuel loads. Now multiply that across a squadron. 5 other Thunderbolts were awaiting depot parts for similar turbo issues. Martin replicated the mod on 2 more aircraft over the next 4 days. Each of those planes went from grounded to operational within 48 hours. That's where the numbers flipped. Depot turnaround time, 12 days. Martin's field mod time, 48 hours. Sortie availability, increase per aircraft, 400%. Projected bomber survival increase based on restored coverage, all 18 per month. The statistics were no longer hypothetical. Within the first 10 days, the modified fighters shot down 4 enemy aircraft, including 2 Me-262s, and successfully defended 3 full bomber runs without a single abort due to overheating or pressure loss. The real punchline? Every single one of Martin's mods was built from scrap. No new parts, no paperwork, just knowledge, risk, and the will to defy logistics with sheer resolve. It wasn't just a technical success. It was a strategic correction. Because in the final months of WWII, the U.S. wasn't losing planes to better enemy technology. It was losing them to internal gaps, downtime, and repair bottlenecks. And no number of shiny blueprints or pristine depot crates could fix that faster than one sergeant with a junk pile and a plan. This wasn't about hacking a plane. It was about hacking the system that let planes die waiting for permission. It started with an argument. "You're not authorized to touch that manifold," barked Lieutenant Caro, the depot liaison. Tech Sgt. Daniel Rusty Martin didn't even flinch. He just pointed at the chalkboard in the hangar. 3 red X's next to flight numbers, all canceled due to engine faults. He didn't need to say a word. The statistics were bleeding across the squadron board, and every grounded Thunderbolt was one step closer to another bomber run without cover. So Caro backed off. Not because he approved, because he had nothing better. Day 1 began at 2200 hours. Martin had a 4-man crew, 1 structural tech, 1 engine specialist, 1 junior wrench monkey, and himself. The canvas tarp over Thunderbolt number 7752 flapped in the wind. The plane's intake ducting had been ripped open by flak. The original exhaust manifold was crumpled like a beer can. Cooling imbalance had already baked half the turbo chamber. Martin opened a crate of salvaged parts, all unofficial. And Me-110 exhaust shroud bent into a crescent. 2 square feet of drop tank aluminum, rough cut from a scrap pile. Lengths of copper tubing scavenged from a crashed B-17's damaged intercom system. No blueprints, no schematics, just instinct. He took the shroud, beat it flat with a mallet, and shaped it into a collar-style exhaust redirect. That became the basis for the new heatsink loop. The tubing formed a bypass arc, snaking under the cowl to bleed radiant heat before it could reach the vulnerable intake lines. The drop tank skin, paper-thin but heat-resistant, was bent into a tapered airflow funnel, designed to compress and channel ram air toward the copper coil zone. By Euro 400, they'd bolted it all in place. The aircraft looked like a Frankenstein prototype, ugly seams, uneven rivets, but aerodynamic in all the ways that mattered. Day 2 was testing. They didn't have wind tunnels. What they had was a fire extinguisher, 2 engineers with clipboards, and a test pilot named Briggs, who was just reckless enough to volunteer. Briggs taxied the plane to the edge of the runway. Martin stood back, arms crossed. The sun had barely risen. The test would be simple. Climb to 20,000 feet under combat throttle, report back on temps, pressure, and responsiveness. If it failed, it would fail loudly. Briggs took off. The bird roared, louder than usual. The modified exhaust note had a deeper pitch. Martin watched as the plane climbed, circling up in a slow spiral, disappearing into the clouds. 10 minutes later, radio crackled. Climb holding at 3,100 feet per minute. Oil temp stable. Manifold solid. Feels like a fresh build. Martin didn't smile. He waited. Briggs returned after a full 40-minute flight. When the wheels touched down, he rolled to a stop, popped the canopy, and shouted, "She climbs like a devil and runs cooler than my last date." The ground crew swarmed. The copper coils radiated warmth, not heat. The airflow funnel showed no signs of stress. The exhaust collar had darkened but held its shape. Martin wrote 3 words on the log sheet. Flight ready. Confirmed. The other mechanics didn't celebrate. They just looked at the wrecked parts piled in the corner. The same pile they'd been ordered to ignore. And then they looked at the sky. If one plane could be rebuilt from junk and still fly better than half the line, what else had they been waiting for? The test was done. The numbers were logged. And by midnight that night, 3 more planes had orders in for boost loop installs. Not from command, from the pilots. Before Martin's field mod, the numbers told a grim story. Each grounded P-47 represented far more than a missing plane. It meant one less slot in the bomber escort formation. It meant wider gaps in the sky. It meant flak zones with no suppression, fighter corridors left exposed, and Luftwaffe jets with one less threat to face on their deadly approach. On paper, one Thunderbolt out of commission seemed insignificant. In practice, it could cost an entire bomber crew their lives. The average mission profile for an Allied bomber run in April 1945 required 10 to 12 escorts per 20 bomber flight. By that stage of the war, German jet fighters, especially Me-262s, were relying on shock-and-run tactics, rapid strikes, high-speed dives, and climbs that could overwhelm any formation with a weak perimeter. What mattered wasn't just firepower, it was presence. When even a single fighter was missing, the formation's defensive envelope collapsed at speed. A weakened left flank, an uncovered high slot, a delay in interception, all multiplied risk. According to squadron combat logs, a missing escort increased the chance of bomber kill hits by 8 to 12%. An overheated or underperforming fighter had 36% higher odds of mission abort. Repairs delayed more than 5 days often resulted in the aircraft missing 3 or more sorties, including priority missions. Now contrast that with the Martin-modified aircraft. Within the first 72 hours of testing, the boost loop-equipped Thunderbolt returned to full operational status. Fuel economy remained within safety margins. Heat buildup dropped an average of 13 degrees at peak climb. And more importantly, pilot confidence surged. The moment the first kill was logged, a Me-262 torn out of the sky by a formerly grounded Thunderbolt, the squadron command realized the implications. This wasn't about just fixing aircraft. It was about creating a force multiplier. With Martin's field mods, grounded aircraft could be turned around 5 times faster than depot repair timelines. That meant one mechanic's upgrade increased the unit's flight-ready strength by over 400% in terms of reduced downtime. More sorties, more pilots in the air, more protection. And with that came results. In the first full week after the first 3 boost loop fighters returned to action, the squadron flew 28 successful missions. 12 enemy aircraft were confirmed downed. 4 of those were German jets. Each kill cost no more than copper tubing and 2 nights of dirty work. Compare that to the cost of losing a bomber. 10 men, $276,000 per aircraft, months of training per crew. Suddenly, the scrap metal upgrade wasn't just a patch job. It was an operational shift. The math didn't lie. Depot fix, 10 to 14 days. Average 2 to 3 missions lost. Boost loop mod, 48 hours, 3 to 4 missions gained. Kill ratio boost, post mod, plus 36%. Bomber loss prevention estimates, first month. Up to 9 B-17s spared, equating to over 90 aircrew saved. And all of it came from one unauthorized decision. Martin hadn't designed a miracle. He'd designed a performance plateau hack, a way to flatten out the worst mechanical drop-offs long enough to keep the aircraft in the air, functional and lethal. He didn't change the aircraft's DNA. He just refused to let its injuries become death sentences. And in that refusal, he exposed the blind spot of an entire logistics doctrine, the false belief that waiting for the right part was better than using the wrong one, even if the wrong one saved lives. Martin's logic didn't care about regulation. It only cared about results. And when the bullets were flying, it turned out that results were the only math that mattered. May 2nd, 1945, near the skies of Regensburg. The war was in its death spiral, but the skies were still savage. Germany, even as it crumbled on the ground, unleashed its final trump cards in the air. The Me-262, sleek, fast, nearly untouchable by standard piston engine aircraft, was executing high-speed attacks on bomber formations retreating to Italy. Captain Elliot "Edge" Carter had been grounded for 5 days before getting his plane back. The same Thunderbolt that had limped home trailing smoke was now fitted with something no one fully understood: a boost loop. An ugly, gleaming pipework bolted under the cowling, held together by clamps and field ingenuity. It was time to test it in combat. Edge launched with the 325th Fighter Group, tasked with covering a wave of B-17s exiting Bavaria. The formation had been hit hard the week prior by Me-262s, using high-speed ambush tactics. This time the plan was clear: climb fast, stay high, intercept early. As the fighters climbed over the Alps, Edge pushed his throttle past where the red line used to be. He waited for the familiar signs of heat creep: sluggish acceleration, shaking gauges, pressure drop. Nothing came. In fact, the plane felt stronger. By 22,000 feet, he was still gaining. Oil temperature, green. Turbo response, flawless. The boost loop was not only working, it was enhancing his power curve. Then came the call: bandits at 10 o'clock, high! 3 Me-262s cut across the horizon, diving toward the bombers. Edge broke off with 2 others in hot pursuit. One Thunderbolt peeled off, unable to keep up. The other wobbled under stress, but Edge's plane surged forward, responding like it had something to prove. He gained altitude, circled wide, and looped into the Me-262's blind zone. A steep roll and flank maneuver impossible in a wounded fighter, unless it wasn't wounded anymore. The jet pulled into a climb. Edge followed. At 25,000 feet, the 2 aircraft were locked in a twisted dance, and then the Me-262 made a mistake. Too steep, too fast. Edge rolled inverted, pulled the trigger. 50 caliber rounds ripped through the sky. Tracers laced into the jet's fuselage. A spark, then flame, then smoke. The Me-262 pitched, spun, and tumbled toward the forest below. The squadron roared in his headset. When Edge landed, Martin was waiting. Covered in grease, sleeves rolled up, still working on the next mod. Edge jumped down, slapped the cowling, and said, "That thing of yours, it eats jets." The kill was logged. The first boost loop-equipped P-47 to score an Me-262 takedown. 2 days later, another, then 2 more. Each time the same blueprint. Martin's design, field installed in 48 hours, restoring full combat capability with nothing but scrap, sweat, and silence. Pilots began calling them ghost birds, planes that came back from the grave. And in the final month of WWII, those ghost birds did more than fly. They hunted. What started as a whisper on the flight line became a roar within a week. By May 6th, the boost loop wasn't just a Martin mod. It was a movement. Word had spread like fire between maintenance tents, briefing rooms, and radio dispatchers. Not through formal channels, but through mechanics themselves. Men who saw the same red tags, the same grounded aircraft, and finally had something they could use to fight back against the creeping paralysis of the depot backlog. 4 more Thunderbolts were modified by other crews using Martin's method based on rough sketches and word-of-mouth instruction. There were no schematics, no training slides. Just scavenged parts, scribbled airflow diagrams, and a silent understanding among ground crews. If it works, don't ask why. At Airfield B-58 in France, Sergeant Javier Morales took it a step further. He didn't just copy Martin's design, he improved it. Using scraps from an old ambulance's radiator system and tubing from a shot-down BF-109, Morales created a closed-loop version of the boost loop that reduced external heat signature and improved efficiency. One pilot described it as cooler, faster, and somehow quieter. By mid-May, no fewer than 19 aircraft across 3 squadrons had been modified. Performance logs told the story. Engine temperatures on long climbs dropped by 14 to 17 degrees Celsius. Climb rates stabilized within 95 to 98% of original performance. Flight-ready rate across those squadrons increased by 31%. But the real indicator wasn't on paper. It was in the air. On May 9th, during a mission over Austria, a formation of 6 boost loop-equipped P-47s intercepted a flight of Arado 234 jets mid-run. The modified Thunderbolts didn't just match speed for engagement. They caught them in climb. 2 jets were destroyed. 1 was damaged and forced to crash land. For bomber crews, this was liberation. Reports described escort fighters that never faded, climb coverage all the way home, and fighters climbing like jets. It didn't go unnoticed by command. At HQ, whispers of unregulated modifications turned into inquiries. Officers questioned why performance reports were surging. When they discovered the boost loop, they threatened to ground every modified plane pending inspection. But the pilots pushed back. Captains filed informal endorsements. One squadron CO even told the brass, "If you ground them, you ground our entire wing. These mods are the only reason we're still flying full strength." Faced with rising kill counts, reduced aborts, and the end of the war in sight, command blinked. No one officially approved the boost loop, but no one stopped it either. The field mod had gone viral. It wasn't about Martin anymore. It was about every wrench turner who had ever been told to wait for the part while watching another plane rot on the tarmac. It was about taking back control, not for glory, but for function, for lives. By war's end, over 40 aircraft across multiple bases were flying with versions of the boost loop. None were officially logged. None were ever mass-produced. But every one of them flew. And many of them came home carrying the stories and the scars of a system that refused to wait for permission to save itself. History doesn't hand out medals to mechanics. There are no parades for the man who wrenched in silence under canvas tarps, using dented tools and broken parts to keep warbirds in the air. But if there were, Tech Sgt. Daniel Rusty Martin would have earned a chest full. He never filed a patent, never published a report. When the war ended, he went home to Oklahoma and disappeared into civilian life like so many others. But the effect of what he built, what he defied, echoed far beyond one hangar in France. Martin didn't just create a fix, he exposed a flaw. The U.S. Air Force's repair doctrine in 1945 was still rooted in industrial predictability. If it wasn't in the manual, it wasn't legal. If it wasn't from a warehouse, it wasn't real. That mindset worked in factories. But war isn't a factory. It's chaos wrapped in bureaucracy, delivered at the speed of death. And Martin broke that. Not recklessly, but precisely. He didn't cut corners to save time. He cut assumptions to save lives. The boost loop was battlefield engineering at its purest. A targeted solution, born from necessity, tested in combat, and repeated only because it worked. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't scalable, but it was right, and it made a difference. Officially, his modified aircraft accounted for 12 confirmed kills, including 4 Me-262s. Unofficially, they saved dozens of bombers and spared hundreds of aircrew by ensuring full escort strength in critical moments. What he did turned the tide, not of the entire war, but of the forgotten micro-battles, the supply fights, the mission coverage gaps, The moments when one less bird in the air could mean one more flag-draped coffin. After the war, some of the boost loop principles quietly made their way into post-war jet engine design. Engineers cited field reports, never naming Martin directly, but referencing adaptive exhaust rerouting, turbine bypass pressure balance, and non-standard duct resilience under stress. In other words, battlefield lessons coded into peacetime progress. He never asked for recognition, but he got results. And long after the last shot was fired, his message remained welded into the bones of every aircraft that flew just a little farther than it was supposed to. Sometimes the fix isn't in the manual. Sometimes it's in the man. Before every takeoff, a pilot checks their gear, scans the gauges, and whispers whatever prayer they believe in. But beneath those wings, often unseen, always unthanked, stand the men who made that flight possible. Not by orders, not by manuals, but by grit, grease, and gut instinct. This story wasn't about a jet. It wasn't about a hero in a cockpit. It was about the mechanic behind the curtain, the one who turned battlefield trash into a kill shot. Martin's story reminds us that in war, as in life, the difference between defeat and survival can come down to one person refusing to accept "not possible" as the answer. So the next time you see a plane roar into the sky, remember this. Someone you never heard of probably made that possible. Someone who didn't wait for the right parts. Someone who didn't follow the rules, because the rules were never meant for the battlefield. Like, subscribe, and share this story if you believe that forgotten mechanics deserve their place in history. Because behind every legend in the sky, there's a shadow on the ground holding a wrench. And that shadow, sometimes that's where the real fight was won.